Hi, everyone. This is Talk Back. It's Thursday, October 28th. And if you know anything about baseball or have any interest in it, you know that we're in the middle of the World Series. And I have a special guest today. We're going to have a lot of fun talking about baseball and a subtopic of that, Jews in baseball. But just to introduce Rabbi Aaron Rosenberg, he and I are of a similar generation. And we remember back in the 50s and 60s rooting for our Chicago Cubs, where he grew up in Chicago, my New York Yankees, where I grew up in New York. And, you know, there were no night games back then. You remember that, Rabbi. There were no night games.
Well, at Wrigley Field, they didn't have them until like maybe 25 years ago.
Exactly. And so I get out of school at what, 2:30 from high school, junior high school and high school, and I turn on my transistor radio. Does anybody know what that is today? Did you have a transistor radio you used back then?
I actually have one in the drawer here.
There you go. You still use it. Wonderful. So let me formally introduce you. So Rabbi Aaron Rosenberg is emeritus because he retired as a rabbi from Temple Emmanuel for I think over what, 40 some odd years. You were the rabbi.
That's right. I was for 40 years. Well, actually, it was 35 years of service, and I've been retired for 6.5 years.
Okay. And he has a lot of interest. I see he's painting now, he tells us, and we'll have a display of that. He's interested in so many subjects, but he's also a baseball fan and a Chicago Cubs fan. And he got his wish a couple of years ago, finally, right, when the Cubs won the World Series. But you also have studied Jews in baseball. So I sent you, and you know, the article that said this year, we need to talk about this, more Jewish players are participating in the World Series than ever before. Talk about that, Aaron.
Well, there are 4 players potentially who could be playing who are Jewish in this World Series. The best known, I suppose, would be Alex Bregman, who plays for the Astros. The least known would be there's a Garrett Stubbs, who's the 3rd string catcher. He's probably not going to play. So it's then if you move to the Braves, you've got Max Fried, who pitched last night, not as well as he should have, but I mean, he's a great pitcher. And you have Jock Peterson, who has been in World Series before with the Dodgers, and then he was with the Cubs earlier this season, and then he was traded to the Braves mid-season. And he's doing pretty well. Last night he was 0 for 4, but in the playoff games he was sensational, and they started calling him Jocktober.
Right. So let's talk about how you got interested in baseball. You know, talking about the show to other people, Jewish friends, I asked them, and some people have no interest at all, and other people are like me, and baseball was a big part of their lives. I grew up not too far from Yankee Stadium, and I fell in love with Mickey Mantle, as I think many American girls did back in the 50s. What was it about baseball that got to you, that made you a big fan?
Well, basketball and football were not as big, at least in the Chicago area. Well, I mean, they existed, but they weren't like baseball. We had 2 teams, we still do, in Chicago. They have the Cubs and the White Sox. And even when the Cubs had bad years, like in the 1950s, it was still exciting to go to games. One summer, I went to 14 games at Wrigley Field. And then we also went to Comiskey Park, Comiskey Park in those days where the White Sox played. I think about baseball, it's something that you could do sandlot. You don't need to have a uniform. You don't need to be enrolled in Little League or something. You could always, in the old days, walk down to the nearest park, which was usually a block or 2 away, and there was a pickup game with the neighborhood kids, and as many as you had, that's how many played. If you had fewer than 9 for a team, you'd have Collier Field. If you had even fewer than that, you can do what was called line ball, or you can at least play catch. Baseball was easy. You didn't need shoulder pads or anything, just a glove and a ball and a bat, and you're in.
Right. So did you have a group of friends who also were fans with you? It wasn't a solitary thing, I'm sure.
I think all the guys in the neighborhood, we were into baseball. We were into baseball cards. I still have my baseball cards. I think I showed you some one time. And we watched it on TV. Like you said, a lot of the games were not played at night. So, like, as soon as we came home from school, we can watch the last two innings of the Cubs game.
Right, right. And so, who were your heroes? Were they just Cubs players, or were some of your heroes from some of the other teams?
I would say they were primarily Cubs and White Sox. People like Ernie Banks, of course, Mr.
Right.
Cub. Nellie Fox, he was a second baseman for the White Sox. Billy Pierce was a great pitcher for the White Sox. So it was mostly Chicago players. I mean, I liked Mantle. I liked Mays. I liked Williams.
Sure. All right. So, what got you interested in learning about Jews in baseball? How did you get started on that track?
I have, over the years, I've given a couple of sermons on Jews in sports. We think back to the biblical period, it seems like Jews weren't into sports. But if you think hard about it, Jacob wrestled, Samson was fierce, David was pretty good with a slingshot. So maybe we always had an interest in sports on some level. And it's just something I think it's not a Jewish thing. We're only 2% of the population in this country and probably less than 1% of the actual baseball players. Although there are a lot of Jews behind the scenes today in baseball. I heard that something like 7 or 8 of the owners or part owners of baseball teams, of the 30 baseball teams today, are Jewish. So we have an interest on that level and elsewhere. Managers, even a couple umpires, announcers for sure.
Right. So there are, and we had talked about the fact that in other endeavors in life, Jews make up an inordinate percentage of different professions compared to their population overall. But in baseball, it's smaller than the population overall. But then, as you say, you're talking about just the players. The auxiliary people around the game probably include a lot of Jewish people as well.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
All right, we're going to turn to your PowerPoint now because it has so many great images, and we'll talk about them as we get into it. So Here we are, Jews and baseball. Can you see this, Aaron?
Not yet. Oh, wait, now it's coming in. Yeah, I do.
All right.
Don't ask me who's who in the pictures. I started looking it over, and I could identify maybe a half dozen of them, maybe a dozen of them, actually.
Let's look at the front row. The front row, I can see Sandy Koufax myself on the number 32.
Okay. Yeah, you got Koufax front and center. Interestingly, Hank Greenberg is right behind him. Greenberg, I would have thought, would have been in the front row.
Sure.
Where it says Brewers, I think that's Ryan Brown. The Blue Jays could have been Sean Green. He was out with them at one time. The Red Sox, it looks like Euclid there. I see in the second row on the right-hand side, Ron Blumberg. And then if you really look hard in what looks like a balcony up there, Lippman Pike is on the right-hand side. He's the third guy on the right. He was the first professional baseball player in the 1860s, I think it was. He actually got a salary for playing baseball. And then there's a few others you might write. Bud Selig, he was the commissioner for a while.
Oh, I see him. Yeah.
He's there, and a few others.
Okay, great. Yeah. All right. So let's move on.
I don't know the painting, but I really like that painting.
It is lovely.
This picture I put in there, if you look closely, there's 60,000 Hasidim at Citi Field where the Mets play in Queens.
Wow.
This was in 2012. When the Mets were obviously out of town, this was not for a game. The Hasidim rented the stadium to have a conference on issues such as the internet, the evils of the internet. Interestingly, it's all men. You don't see any women. Apparently, they didn't have a problem with that.
Wow. What year was that again?
I posed the question there, why do Jews like baseball? I think, and one of the ways that I would look at this is football is a rougher sport. George Carlin, may rest in peace, did a humorous bit where he would say, in baseball, they wear a cap, but in football, they wear a helmet. Baseball is played on a diamond in a park. Football on a gridiron. So he had that kind of line in there. Baseball has a 7th-inning stretch. Football has a 2-minute warning.
Yeah.
So I think it's a gentler sport. It's competitive. It really requires. It's not so much brawn. It's more of a dexterity.
Right. And yeah.
Why do Jews like it? As I said, it's a neighborhood game. People could play it as a pickup game, but it's in the summer. That's when people have more leisure and free time.
Right.
And it's the national pastime. What can I say?
Right. And also, I think in today's very busy world and social media and everything is fast, a lot of young people think baseball is boring. And, I think back to the movie The Natural and other movies where there's almost an elegiac, a very elegant, right, nostalgic, lovely feeling about baseball, which, I don't get about football or other sports. But I think our young people are missing out, and many of them are not as interested in baseball as we were when we were young. Do you agree with that?
I don't know the statistics on it. I do know this. You mentioned some people think it's boring. When my Russian cousin moved here about 30 years ago, I took him to a Red Sox game, and he was yawning. There was so much time between pitches and between batters and between innings. He was saying, this isn't like soccer where, you're constantly, all 22 guys on the field are running around like crazy. It's a slower game, but there's highlights to it also. Even games that are low run games, there's the pitchers and and the defense that's going on.
It's boring to people who don't understand the ins and outs of what's happening in the moment, but it's very suspenseful, even more suspenseful than a fast game when you're waiting for that pitch on a 3-2 count or an 0-2 count, right? That's very suspenseful, and the waiting is excruciating and part of the fun of the game, I think, which people who say it's boring don't appreciate. The other thing I wanted to point out from this picture is all of these Hasidim with the black hats and the coats. In the old days, Aaron, talk about this. When we see scenes of baseball stadiums, all the guys were there, mostly more guys than women there, and they were all wearing suits and ties and hats, right?
Well, I get a kick out of that. When I look at the films of baseball games in the 1930s or 40s even, the men were wearing hats, and they're all wearing a tie. You wouldn't see that today. No. That would be unusual. Now it's a very casual game. It's laid back.
Right. Okay, let's move on. What do we have? Okay, so we wanted just to highlight, we're going to go back in history soon, but because we have the World Series right now, we just had games 1 and 2 in Houston, and they tied it 1-1. Houston won last night. Almost a mirror image of the first game, right? Both games.
Right. Yeah. Score wise. Yeah. It's that's the thing about baseball. You could blow out a team one day and then get killed the next day by them. It has a lot to do with the pitcher, I think, but sometimes it's the strategies that are used, and players have on days and off days. I think it's a mental game as well as physical.
Right. So let's start with talk a little bit about this guy because he pitched last night.
Yeah, Max Fried's only been in the majors for a few years. He won 17 games in 2019. In 2020, which is a shorter season, he was 7-0, like no losses, and a 2.25 ERA. This year he was 14-7, which is still pretty good. So he was the number 2 in the rotation for the World Series. I think people expected more out of him. He pitched for, I guess, 4 or 5 innings last night. He gave up 5 runs. I don't think he had as much control, although he did have a number of strikeouts too. He's a great pitcher, and he's going to be around for a long time.
Yeah. Well, hope he'll get another chance. Hopefully, if the series goes a little longer, he'll get another start.
That's right. He probably will. Interestingly, one of the big issues through history was, should Jewish players play on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year? As you probably know, Greenberg and Koufax didn't play on Yom Kippur. Max Fried did play on Yom Kippur, and he got shellacked, as I understand it. So the Holy One, blessed be she, works in mysterious ways.
That's funny. Let's go on to Jack Peterson. He
Jack
played
Peterson,
last night.
Yeah, he's, it's who we call a Jew is interesting. If you look back to the era of, let's say, Koufax and Greenberg, the Jewish players usually grew up in Jewish neighborhoods. They had two Jewish parents. They had bar mitzvahs. They went to the synagogue, even if they weren't all that religious. Nowadays, you have players who are, one of their parents are Jewish. They may or may not have had a bar mitzvah. They may or may not have had any connection with Judaism. But at the same time, we embrace them, especially if they're doing well.
Right.
So Jack Peterson, he has a non-Jewish father and a Jewish mother. The traditional definition of who is a Jew is someone who has a Jewish mother or someone who converts. So, technically he would fall into that category.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, he's played for other teams.
We have here, it's missing. If you've noticed, this season, a lot of the players are wearing these like gold necklaces. Well, he put on pearls. Did you see that? It was
yeah.
I'm not sure why. It says Jack Peterson, but it doesn't look like him that much in the picture.
Well, don't forget, Aaron. I should have got. He's with the Boston.
That's not Jack Peterson in the picture.
It's not.
No, because he played with the Dodgers, then with the Cubs, and then the Braves. That's his name down there, but that's not him in the picture.
Oh, maybe I confused him with someone else. Is that Alex Bregman?
That's Alex Bregman, yes.
Okay.
He's actually only 5'4", but you can see he's all muscle. And he's been around for 5 or 6 years, and he's been sensational. He was a couple of years ago, he was the runner-up for the MVP. He was the MVP of the All-Star game recently. If there is a fly in the ointment, it was that he was on the Astros team when they were caught stealing signs. They had a camera in the center field that zoomed in on the catcher giving the sign to the pitcher on whether it's going to be a fastball or a curve, in or out or whatever. And they were transferring that information to the dugout where they were giving signals to the batter so they would know what to expect. And he was on that team, and so he's somewhat tainted, but even so, he's a great player. He plays the field.
Well, I think when you read in the media, a lot of people are not rooting for the Astros, and many of them are still blaming the Astros for that behavior during that World Series, and it's going to be hard to forgive them. Do you think that's going to hurt his chances if he makes it to the Hall of Fame voting?
No, probably not. Not much. Not as much as, let's say, steroids or throwing a game like the 1919 Black Sox and so on. No, he's a pretty clean-cut player for the most part.
Yeah. Well, of course, stealing signs is something that was well known and done in baseball all the time. I guess just the way they did it so perfectly technologically with all the equipment they used made it that much worse, right?
Yeah. Even now, you can see what if you know what the numbers mean, and you can figure it out after an inning or two, you could see how that could have happened.
Yeah. All right, and this Garrett Stubbs, and maybe
right,
he's Garrett
that's
Stubbs.
Not a picture of Garrett Stubbs again. I don't know. Garrett Stubbs is that third string catcher for the Astros. He is Jewish, and Dean Kramer. This guy is not only Jewish, but he's actually Israeli. His family has lived in both Israel and in California. In fact, even now he spends 2 months a year in the off season in Israel. He didn't have a good season this year. I think he was 1 win and 8 losses. So I don't know how long he's going to be around, but
That's true. All right. Kevin
Kevin Pillar
Pillar.
is a player. He was with the Mets. I guess he still is with the Mets. He was hit earlier in the season while he was batting by a 94-mile-an-hour pitch that hit him in the face. And since then, he's been wearing like a shield or a clear shield when he bats. He was with the Toronto. Oh, no, he's not with the Toronto Blue Jays, I think. I think he got traded there.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, he's an outfielder, center fielder. Okay. Rowdy Tellez, he's actually with the Milwaukee Brewers now. But at any rate, Rowdy is a nickname. His real name is Ryan. But apparently when he was in the womb, he was bouncing around so much that he already had the nickname Rowdy.
Okay.
He's a designated hitter. Ryan Sheriff, all I know is that this guy is a relief pitcher for the Blue Jays. I'm sorry, for the Tampa Bay Rays. Apparently a lefty.
Yeah. All right. And Richard Blyer, have you heard of him?
Yeah, he was with the Miami Marlins, a relief pitcher. I didn't follow them closely enough to see if he's still around. I see he's a lefty there. Yeah.
Okay. Now Ryan Braun didn't play the season, but he was very good player. Tell us a little about him.
He was a great player. He was called the Hebrew Hammer. By the way, the original Hebrew Hammer was Judah Maccabee, because the word Maccabee could mean hammer. But Hank Greenberg had that nickname. Sean Green had that nickname. Al Rosen was called the Hebrew Hammer. Ryan Braun certainly deserves it. He had, I think it was 352 home runs. He was Rookie of the Year in 2007. He was a 6-time All-Star, played with the Milwaukee Brewers. The fly in the ointment on him is that he took some steroids, performance-enhancing drugs, and he was caught with that. I think he was fined. He might have had to skip part of a season. He's now retired. At the beginning of the season, I guess he wasn't picked up by Milwaukee, and I thought others would, but they didn't take him, so he just retired.
Okay. And Gabe Kapler?
Gabe Kapler is... he's now, as you said, a manager for the Giants. It's interesting to see him in a Giants uniform. We associate him with the years that he was with Boston, and he won a World Series or two. He's Jewish. He wasn't all that religious. He thinks of himself as a secular or cultural Jew, although he does have a Star of David tattoo on his calf.
Really?
He's a good player.
Okay.
He's a good player.
Okay. All right, now let's go back to the beginning.
Okay, now we're going to this Lippman Pike I mentioned. He was the first baseball player to actually make a salary, $20 a week.
Wow.
I guess they didn't get paid that much. Well, I don't know what that is worth today. It's probably worth a lot more. Next.
Even the players that when we were growing up, like the Mantles and the Mays, they made maybe 100,000 was like a lot for them back then.
Yeah, Babe Ruth got the most. He got 100,000. Gehrig, who was almost as good, got significantly less because he wasn't demanding it. It wasn't part of his nature. The truth is that players, until about maybe the 1970s or 80s, were not making the big bucks. And many of them only had 4 or 5 years in the majors.
Right.
And even in the off season, in the old days, you might remember this, they were selling cars or clothes or going back to the family business.
Right.
That was a very common thing until more recently.
Right. So who did Lippman Pike play with?
Well, he played with the Athletics, the Philadelphia Athletics. A lot of the teams were East Coast teams in those days, and certain cities had 2 teams. You had Philadelphia had 2 teams, Boston had 2 teams, St. Louis had 2 teams. New York had 3 teams.
Right.
Chicago still has the 2 teams.
Right. And so the World Series was just a simple series of games between the American League and the National League. Right?
And they were on the train. They would take train or bus, from one place to another. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Tell us about these.
So this Barney Pelty, he was a pitcher who had an earned run average. I think it was a lifetime earned run average of like 2.62, which is actually better than Koufax. Koufax wasn't that great the first 4 or 5 years. He didn't get really hot until he exploded, let's say 1960 to 66. So he had several good years. By the way, he was called the Yiddish Curver. Erskine Mayer, another pitcher, he was like in earned run average, he was like 3rd after Pelty and then Koufax and then Erskine Mayer. Barney Dreyfuss was the owner of the Pittsburgh Pirates for about 30 years. And he also could be credited to organizing the first World Series. I think it was 1906. That's when the American League was pretty well firmed up and the National League had been already firmed up. So they were able to have the competition between them. By the way, in the old days, actually, I say old days, when we grew up, there were only 16 teams, 8 in each league.
Right.
Now we've got the divisions, and there's 30 teams out there.
You think do you like all of the wild cards and all of the?
Yeah, I think so. But what happens is you'll have a team like the Braves that only won 86 games and didn't even have an over 500 percentage until August 6th. Going to the World Series, and then you have the Dodgers who won 106 games and they didn't make it. So that could happen, but I like that. It sort of keeps more teams in the mix. Otherwise, you get teams that are totally, they had a good season, but they're sort of out of it with 1 month to play. It takes the excitement out of it.
Well, the wild card teams have won the World Series, haven't they?
They do sometimes, and I was glad to see that our Red Sox were in it for a while.
Right.
They wouldn't have been in otherwise.
Right.
Now, the Black Sox scandal at the bottom there, this was in 1919. Chuck Comiskey, who owned the White Sox, was notoriously frugal. Even though he made a fortune from them, he didn't pay his players very much. And the morale on the team, and it was one of the best it was the best team that year, was pretty low. So a couple of Chicago thugs approached some of the players. Actually, they had 8 of them, and they talked them into throwing the World Series and letting the Cincinnati Redlegs win. So, and the bettors, the gamblers, were going to obviously bet on the Reds, who were the team that was supposed to lose. It didn't really have any teeth in the offer until Arnold Rothstein, who was a big, not just gambler, but he was a major crime lord, you might say, of the New York City area. He backed it and put in some money and made it happen. The outcome was that not all of the team even knew about it. But after a while, it was pretty clear that some of the pitchers were just throwing wild pitches. Some of the players were dropping balls unnecessarily, striking out guys. Guys who are major hitters were striking out, and like Shoeless Joe Jackson and so on. And so what happened is Ring Lardner and another sports announcer said, this is obviously a fix. And after the season was over, they established the first commissioner, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who was supposed to be Judge Landis was very serious. And he banned those, even though they were acquitted in the courts because there wasn't enough hard evidence. He banned those players from baseball, including Shoeless Joe Jackson. By the way, Arnold Rothstein was acquitted as well, but he died several years later when he was playing poker and he stiffed someone. He reneged on paying what he owed that person, and I guess the guy shot him to death.
Oh, okay. Wow. Okay. Was he in this a generation of Bugsy Siegel and who was he at Maya
Yeah, well,
Lansky
Meyer
and that
Lansky, well,
crowd?
those guys
Yeah.
actually were a little bit later than him. They were the 1930s and 40s. He was
Yeah.
more of like the 20s and even
Yeah.
earlier. He died by age 46 for him.
Wow. Okay. All right.
Now, Hank Greenberg is arguably the best of the Jewish Major League Baseball players. He came up. Uh, he was he went to Detroit, even though he's from the New York City area. He went to Detroit and the Tigers. And Detroit was a tough city for a New York Jew to play in. This was a city that had Henry Ford, who was a notorious anti-Semite, had been publishing the Dearborn Independent, where he reprinted the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. You had Father Coughlin doing a weekly radio show, but very often had anti-Semitic things to say. And Greenberg did take a lot of heat from the audience, booing him and calling him names and things like that. But every time he hit a home run, he said, "I felt I was hitting a home run against Hitler."
Wow.
He did very well. Speaking of the home runs, 1934, 1935. 1938 was the year that he had the most home runs. He had 58 home runs, approaching Babe Ruth's record of 60 with 2 weeks to go, and people thought for sure he was going to break that record. There was a rumor that that the pitchers, anti-Semitic pitchers, wouldn't pitch to him in the last few days. That really, Hank Greenberg and the Life and Times of Hank Greenberg, a documentary put together by Aviva Kemperer. Greenberg himself says that's not true. He had a number of hits, including a few doubles and triples, but he was facing some tough pitchers, people like Bob Feller, and he just wasn't able to hit the home runs on the last few days.
Yeah.
But he, like many of the players, he answered the call of duty. In 1940, he was actually drafted, but he served till 1945. And those would have been prime years for him. That's why he only had 331 career home runs.
Right.
When he came back, he did help the Tigers win that World Series in 1945, I think it was. But in 1947, he was traded to Pittsburgh, of all places. And one of my favorite stories is that he had a hit, and he was running to first base, and he collided with Jackie Robinson, the first black in the major leagues. And the audience was booing Robinson. And actually, Greenberg got up and pulled him up and put his arm around him and said something like, "Kid, they did the same thing to me. They called me names. You're going to be okay. Stick to the program. You're going to be a sensational star." Well, that's part of the story. The second part of the story is that I had an unusual experience in my life I think it was 2003. We had an interfaith service at First Congregational Church in Old Lyme. And by coincidence, as I was standing in the receiving line, coming through the line next to each other without even knowing each other, was Elva Greenberg, the daughter of Hank Greenberg, followed by Jackie Robinson's wife, Rachel Robinson,
Right. She lives
who was
in
a member of
Salem.
the
Yeah.
congregation. And
Yeah.
I introduced them to each other and told them the story, which they probably already knew.
Oh, wow.
And just, it was one of those serendipitous things that happens, maybe once or twice in a lifetime. How can you imagine that happening? What a coincidence.
Oh, wow. Did you take a photo of them by any
No,
chance?
I didn't have a camera. I was
Oh,
just standing in line in the receiving line there.
Oh, that is a great story. Yeah, Rachel Robinson lives in Salem. She sometimes comes into Colchester.
Right.
Coffee. Yeah, it's a terrific story. Okay, Mo Berg.
Mo Berg is another one who has had several. Aviva Kemper did a documentary on his life, but there was also a movie starring Paul Rudd called The Catcher Behind Home Plate. He played in the 1920s and 30s. This was a time when most of the baseball players in the major leagues came off the farm and didn't have even a high school education in many cases. They say Shoeless Joe Jackson even wasn't literate. But Mo Berg was the exception to that. Someone said he was the smartest player in baseball. He supposedly spoke 12 different languages. He was, I think, a valedictorian of his high school in Newark, but he went on to Princeton and he went to Columbia for law school and even took courses at the Sorbonne. Casey Stengel once said Mo Berg was the strangest person in baseball. He said he may be able to speak a dozen languages, but he strikes out in every one of them. He was all field, no hit, but he was a good enough catcher. The catcher has to be a smart player because he's calling the pitches. He has to know what the batter's weaknesses are. He has to know what the pitcher's strengths are. It's a hard position to play. And Mo Berg was able to stay in the majors for 15 years, I think it was. What's interesting about him is that he was able to, in 1934, I think it was, there was a group of American baseball players like Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Jimmy Fox, and others who went over, they formed a team, they went over to Japan and played some exhibition games. Mo Berg was on that team. It's not clear why, but he was on that team. And I think it was because they wanted him, he was a good catcher, and he could catch the fastballs that various pitchers were pitching. He broke away from the socializing, and he was filming Tokyo with a camera that he had, a movie camera that he had. And he shared that information at the time of World War II with the American government. And that's why they called him, he was like a spy, but he's a spy for us. He also was sent on a special mission to Italy and Germany to find out if Werner Heisenberg, one of the leading German scientists, if the Germans were on the verge of the atomic bomb. And he was told, if they are, kill Heisenberg. He was actually packing heat. As it turns out, Heisenberg said, no, we're not that close. And he came back with that report. And sure enough, the United States was that close with the help of some Germans scientists like Werner von Braun, who came to the United States. And we were able to beat them to that. And we ended the war with Japan because of that.
Right.
Okay, so that's
was there a movie? You said there was a movie
about there was a movie
this?
with Paul Rudd, The Catcher Behind Home Plate, and it didn't do well at the box office. It had Jeff Daniels and some other stars in it, but it was just so. I saw it twice.
Did it go into these exploits in Europe? Did it do that though?
Yeah, that was a big part of it. That was big.
Okay. All right.
Buddy Meyer, we claim him as Jewish, but apparently I read recently that his parents or his grandparents had already converted to Christianity, and he was not a practicing Jew, but he was a superstar of an earlier period, I think 19 teens and so on. Harry the Horse Danning was a catcher, played with the Giants in the 1930s and 40s. Supposedly, the story is told that in the old days when they went by bus, the team was down in the South for the Grapefruit League, and the hotel that the Giants were supposed to stay at wouldn't allow Harry Danning and Weintraub, another Jewish player on the team. They wouldn't allow them to stay there. So Bill Terry, the ex-Yankee, who was the manager of the Giants, saw the owner of the hotel and said, then we're all pulling out. And they said, well, wait a minute. No, we'll let those two Jewish guys stay, which was interesting.
That's so interesting because, we always hear about the Green Book, places where only Black players, Black artists, Black people could stay. I wonder if there was a book where Jews could stay.
That would be a good question. Yeah. There were signs, no Jews allowed, no Catholics allowed, even in the South sometimes.
Right. Interesting.
So, Yeah, interestingly, the black, as you know, we had the Negro Leagues, and the Negro Leagues had some superstars, especially in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who was the commissioner for 25 years, he's the one who kept the blacks out, and he resisted the pressure and finally gave in. Actually, I think he had retired just in time for when Jackie Robinson did come in. But he said they got their own league. And it's a shame because some of those superstars, like someone like Satchel Paige, got to be a rookie in 1948, but he was already 46 years old. And then you have a number of these. Willie Mays played in the Negro Leagues. I think Hank Aaron had 1 or 2 years in and those were some great teams and great players who, in my lifetime, the blacks couldn't play in the major leagues.
In so many areas of life, we miss so much out because of discrimination and prejudice. It's really outrageous. But
nowadays, thankfully, it's open. It's a meritocracy. Whoever's good gets in. And what you'll notice is, you look in the dugouts of most teams, especially in the Astros, you're going to see the first language that's being spoken is not English. It's Spanish.
Right. Dominican Republic has it. Yeah.
A lot of Caribbean players. Sid Gordon was another superstar. These guys were all-stars 2 or 3 times. But a lot of these players took off, as did Ted Williams and others. They took off the 1940s and served their country in World War II.
Right. All right. Here's here's our era.
Al Rosen, he was the Rookie of the Year. I think it was 1950, but he retired by 1956. He had a bad back. There were a lot of injuries that he sustained, but he was the MVP in 1953. He was on that World Series team for the Indians in 1954. He had the most RBIs for 2 different years. He stayed on in baseball as a general manager for 3 different teams, the Yankees and the Giants, and I can't remember which one was the third one. He just died a few years ago.
Yeah.
Sandy Koufax, again, arguably, like Hank Greenberg, the other Jewish Hall of Famer, terrific. The best left-handed pitcher, some say, ever. As I mentioned earlier, the first few years he didn't do that well, but all of a sudden he had a 6-year run like nobody's had. He had 4 no-hitters. He had 1 perfect game. He had all those victories in the World Series. He chose not to play on Yom Kippur, as did Hank Greenberg. Everyone assumed that Koufax was in synagogue. He wasn't. He stayed in the hotel room. Although there was a rabbi who said, I saw him in the congregation, and I nodded to him like I wasn't going to give him away. No, he was in the hotel room. He was more of a secular Jew. But in those days, if you were Jewish and you felt the pressure not to work, it was be an embarrassment to your fellow Jews. And so, by the way, his real name wasn't Koufax. He was born Sanford Brown. His mother divorced Jack Brown and married Irving Koufax when I think Koufax was 5 or 6. He became an announcer for a few years, but he didn't feel suited to it or whatever. And he's still around. You see him now and then. Ken Holtzman was a great pitcher too, not on the level of Koufax, but close to it. He had 2 no-hitters. He played for 3 or 4 teams, most notably for the A's. By the way, Ken Holtzman, observant, didn't play on Yom Kippur. Larry Sherry, in the 1959 World Series, where the Dodgers played against my White Sox. The Dodgers defeated the White Sox, and Larry Sherry as a relief pitcher, he got 2 saves and 2 wins. So he did very well. Ron Blumberg, pronounced Bloomberg, even though it's spelled Blumberg, He wrote a book, an autobiography called Designated Hebrew, because he was the
That's
first
cute.
designated hitter. And if you go to Cooperstown to the Hall of Fame, you'll see the bat where he was walked, but because the bases were loaded, he got credit for an RBI, I think. Ron Blumberg. He was supposed to be a superstar, but he had a lot of injuries, and after about 7 or 8 seasons, he was done. Mike Epstein, also known as Mike Superstar Epstein, was supposed to be the new Babe Ruth. He petered out after 5 or 6 seasons, but he was.
So was Ron Bloomberg the very first one to be a designated hitter in a World
First
Series
designated
game?
hitter. He's actually the brother-in-law, or former brother-in-law, I should say, of my friend Mark Goldsmith.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Okay.
All right, let's see. Did I
No,
skip?
these are players you thought were Jews, but they're really not. Rod Carew, by the way, you know the Adam Sandler Hanukkah song. Oh, wait, where do we go?
Yeah, we got to go to the 1990s now.
Oh, we're going to those guys.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
well, I think we talked about, well, maybe we didn't talk about him as much as I could have. Sean Green was not, he was a very marginal Jew, but he was taken in by the Jewish community of Toronto and then later Los Angeles when he played with the Dodgers. And he chose not to play on Kol Nidre. However, there were 2 World Series games because there was a day game the next day. He did play on that game.
He got confused. He got confused.
He got confused, maybe. But he had a great record, a lot of home runs, a lot of hits. He's not in the Hall of Fame, but he's close. Gabe Kapler, we talked about a little bit. He's now a manager, as is Brad Osmus. Brad Osmus played for a number of seasons as a catcher, but he was the manager of the Tigers, and then now he's the manager with the Angels. Kevin Youkilis, or Uke, played with several teams, but most notably with the Red Sox. And Theo Epstein, when he was the general manager, was asked whether he thought Youkilis and Kapler should play on Yom Kippur. And he said, they weren't starters that year. So he said, it's not going to make that much of a difference. Let them decide for themselves. Ryan Braun, we talked about him. As I said, he's retired now, but he had a lot of home runs and he had many great seasons. Ian Kinsler retired this year, but he did something this year. He actually was the one of the top players on the Team Israel. You may know that Israel played in the Olympics.
Right.
This year. They had baseball in the Olympics. There were only 6 teams. So Israel said, hey, all we have to do is win half the games and we'll probably get a bronze. Unfortunately, they were 1 victory and 4 losses.
Right.
But the team there were only a couple of Israelis on that team. Most of them were minor league Jewish players from the United States who had at least one Jewish parent or grandparent or were married to someone Jewish, but who had dual citizenship. They somehow created the ability to play for Israel. It didn't work, though. Okay, next page. Okay, now these are the players who you might have thought they were Jewish. Rod Carew, for example, in the Hanukkah song that Adam Sandler sang, he said Rod Carew is Jewish. No, he was not Jewish. He was married to a Jew, Marilyn Levy, for many years. They raised their kids as Jewish. He even wore a chai. But I understand now he got divorced from Marilyn Levy. He married a born-again Christian, and he is born-again Christian too. So
Okay, I thought the rumors, or I thought he had converted, but I guess you're not. You're right.
But he's a Hall of Fame
married to-
player. He's a Hall of Fame player, as is Lou Boudreau. I remember Lou Boudreau very well. I mean, he played into the 1950s, but his major part of his career is in the 40s. And he has a Jewish mother, but was raised Catholic. Now, who is a Jew is a big question. As I said, traditionally,
Yeah.
you had to have a Jewish mother. But then the Reform movement said you have to have at least one Jewish parent, but you have to be raised Jewish and identify as Jewish. Boudreaux did not practice Judaism, so he was a Catholic, proud Catholic. But we'll claim him anyway because he is in the Hall of Fame. He was a player manager. You don't see that every day.
Okay.
And he was a Hall of Famer. He was the MVP in 1948. He was a Cubs announcer even for a couple of years. Great player. Now, these other names, they have Jewish names. Now, that tells me that maybe someone in their family was Jewish a generation or two earlier.
Right. Yeah.
I put in the names Jim Palmer at the bottom. He wasn't Jewish, the pitcher, Jim Palmer, but he had two Jewish stepfathers.
Oh.
His mother got divorced from the first husband. She had a second husband and then a third husband. Number 2 and 3 were Jewish. So he has a Jewish connection there. Johnny Kling, he was not a superstar. He was a major player in the early 1900s. He himself was not Jewish, but he married a Jewish woman, was married by a rabbi. So I had a book on Jewish all-stars, and they included Johnny Kling, but he would not have qualified. But even if we lose some of these guys, we gain because there were several converts to Judaism. Elliot Maddox, Jeff Newman, Steve Yeager. Those guys are great players. We'll take them. We'll claim them.
Okay. All right.
Next. Okay, well, this is the non-playing Jews, just a few of them. And what role did they play? Bud Selig was the owner. Well, actually, he bought the Seattle Pilots in 1992, and he moved them to his hometown of Milwaukee, and they're the Milwaukee Brewers. The commissioner is chosen by the owners, and he was the commissioner from something like 1992 or 3 till 2015. And there were a lot of changes that happened in baseball in that period. He brought in a number of Latino and even Asian players, the divisions, the expansion, the wild card, the interleague playing. I mean, who thought that the Cubs and White Sox would play against each other other than in some non-counting game? So there were also the baseball strike that took place in 1994. The last month and 2 of the season, in the World Series, they didn't play that year. He had to sort of negotiate that very complex period. And then you had the players with the steroids. They now have an asterisk by their name. Mark McGwire.
So I remember, Aaron, when Selig took over from, wasn't it? Giamatti died suddenly, right?
Yeah,
he was
very suddenly. Yeah.
And I thought when Bud Selig, he was an owner of a team, and I thought when he came on, I remember reading that it would just be temporary, but then he just stayed on forever.
He did stay on forever. It was interesting. David Stern was the commissioner or the head of the basketball of NBA. You had 2 Jews in these major positions where Jews were not, there weren't that many of them on the field or on the court, but they're behind the scenes.
Right.
Marvin Miller was the one who, from 1966 to 1983, was the head of the Baseball Players Association, their union.
Right.
And he was significant because prior to that, the owner of the team owned the players. They would say whether they could be traded, they could fire them at will, and so on. Baseball players got more leverage under Marvin Miller, who actually came from the steel union, steelworkers union, and the free agency, for example, came in time. The next fellow there is Don Fair. I know him because in Indiana University, in the Sigma Alpha Mu fraternity, he was my pledge son, or I was his pledge father, you might say. He was a year younger than me. He took over from Marvin Miller. I think there was an interim person for a year or 2, but he took over from 1983 to I think it was till 2009. He's now the head of the National Hockey League Players Association.
Right.
He's the one who actually, the 1994 strike, the baseball players' strike, Don Fear was the one behind that. Sport Magazine said he's the fifth most powerful person in baseball. And he was that's all I'll say about him. He was a tough, I even though he's my pledge son, I should say nice things about him. I saw him, he spoke at Temple Emmanuel in New York City about 6 or 7 years ago. And I brought my confirmation class down to hear him. And I went up to him afterwards. I said, "Hey, Don, long time no see." And he was he wasn't as warm and fuzzy as I had hoped he would be. He said, "Oh, hi, Aaron, I got to go now," or something like that. So Theo Epstein, he's the one who, sort of in a Jerry Maguire kind of way, but even better, he was the one who took his Yale education. It was in law degree. He was able to parlay it into studying what teams really needed and how to go about getting those players and how best to use their investments and so on. And he took the Red Sox, who had not won a World Series in 100 years, and he was able to put them on a new track where in the 21st century, they've been in 4 World Series already. So he did the same thing for the Chicago Cubs, my Chicago Cubs, in 2016, a team that had been woefully in the bottom half of their division. All of a sudden, they invested in a lot of young talent that paid off. Oddly enough, this last season, the Cubs have lost almost that entire team that they had in 2016 when they beat the Indians and won the World Series. Theo Epstein, by the way, has moved on. I'm not exactly sure where he is. But the one name that I didn't put on here, but I should have, is Chaim Bloom. Chaim Bloom does the same thing. He did it for the Tampa Bay Rays, and he's now doing it for Boston. You bring someone on, their position is essentially to use their brains to figure out what this team needs and to make the trades to make that happen.
Right.
And look, the Red Sox went further this year than we thought they would. So that seems to be working. Jerry Reinsdorf is an owner of the White Sox. Ted Lerner was an owner of the Washington Nationals. Peter Guber, an owner or part owner of the Dodgers. Stan Kasten, another part owner of the Dodgers. So, as I say, they're involved, but they're not in the front. They're not on the field, but these are the behind-the-scenes people.
Right. Oops,
And the last one that we're looking at, this one is the announcers. Yeah. Mel Allen, whose real name is Mel Allen Israel, he was the voice of the Yankees. He's the one who coined the expressions like, "How about that?" or "going, gone."
Oh, I listened to him. I listened to him and Red Barber, who wasn't Jewish, but Mel Allen and Red Barber were my two guys way back when.
Right, and these guys did it for a long time. Mel Allen had a Southern drawl, but he somehow played very well in New York City. I mean, the fans loved him. Howard Cosell, his real name is Howard Cohen, and he was he did occasional baseball games, like major games, but he was more of like, he did boxing, he would do whatever. He was, TV Guide called him the all-time best sportscaster. He just had a way with words. Son of a rabbi, he was, by the way. Marty Glickman was an athlete from New York area. He went on to announce radio and before game and post games. Steve Stone was a Cy Young award-winning pitcher. He was an announcer for the Cubs for many years, and then he switched over to the White Sox, interestingly. Writers, Chaim Potok, who did The Chosen, he had a Hasidic boy who was a great pitcher who beamed an Orthodox student. They're both going to different yeshivas. That was a great book in the 1970s, I'm guessing, maybe 80s even.
Still putting on plays. I saw The Chosen in a play,
Bernard Malamud wrote The Natural, which you mentioned. There's Damn Yankees. The music was written by Richard Adler and Jerry Ross. There are several authors who've written things with a baseball theme to them. And then the last thing I put on here was baseball cards. Cy Berger gets credit for making Topps the top baseball card producer. Although I saw that now the Baseball Players Association is now, they're not necessarily guaranteeing that Topps is going to get all of their contracts. But baseball cards, which were huge. By the way, the card that you see in that picture is a 1954 Sandy Koufax. He really didn't play till 1955. But he was a bonus baby. He got a huge contract, and that card, I had two of them when I was a kid. My brothers and I. My youngest brother, who was very young at the time, drew a mustache, like handlebar mustache, and a goatee on that Koufax, which reduced the value of that card from perhaps four figures to maybe single digits. But I still do have a rookie Koufax. And that's
Is this your card? Is this photo your card?
No. Wait, maybe that is. Yeah, I think I did do a photo of that and put that on there. Yeah. So this is Jews in baseball. This is that Israeli team that didn't do so well this year. But by the way, they practiced in Arizona. So they were mostly Americans. But, this happens with the Olympics. You find a lot of the NBA players that we think of as Americans are actually coming from Canada or Australia or Europe, and they end up playing for those teams when it comes time for the.
It's almost not fair that they just build a team around whoever they can grab under your flag, but whatever.
They had a couple of Israelis on that team, but the truth is baseball is an American thing. It's a Caribbean thing. It's a Japanese thing. I don't know that it's played that much in other countries.
All right. So now we would have finished with this one last photo, and then there's a photo that I put on Facebook with you at the Met Stadium at Citi Field with a guy. But talk about this.
Okay, well, these are two pictures. You got both of those pictures in there. Okay, so you see me shaking hands with Mr. Met just prior to the game. My son David is in the picture with Karen and myself and Mr. Met. And David's brother-in-law, also David Greenwald, was a sports announcer for some college teams and so on. And he had connections with people who were doing the announcing for the Mets. So for my final night at work, after 40 some odd years as a rabbi, the congregation brought 75 people to Citi Field for the Mets-Cubs game. By the way, the Cubs won. And so David had arranged for me to come down on the field. I thought I was going to be throwing out the first pitch. Look, Elie Wiesel did it at one time. I thought Rochelle Walensky did it this year. Maybe I would get to do that. No, didn't happen. But I did get to shake hands with Mr. Met about 10 minutes before the game started. And that was actually on the Jumbotron. They actually broadcast it.
Wow.
And that's the 75 of us in the stands there. You can see myself and my wife were both sort of in orange there.
Right.
Our granddaughter, who's now 12 years old, and some of our friends behind us. So it was, I still follow baseball more than I do other sports. And I always will. I will say this. I can give you the rosters of teams from the 1950s and 60s much better than I could today.
All right, but there was one other encounter that day, Aaron, when you had that celebration.
Right, yeah.
Citi
I was
Field.
on the Jumbotron. There was a fellow who is a huge Mets fan, and he goes to almost all the home games, even though he lives in Boston. This is the strange thing about it. And I did his wedding like 20 years before, 30 years before, maybe even. In fact, I barely remembered it. He wasn't a member. He had just contacted me. He was getting married in Portland, Connecticut. And so I had lost touch with this fellow. And all of a sudden he sees me on the Jumbotron. He goes, by the way, he not only goes to every game, but he actually photographs on the field the players in the pregame and the after the game, and sometimes during the game. So he found where I was seated. He came up to me and we were chatting for a while. And he even called his wife. I chatted with her on the phone. And it was kind of interesting. You know, I brought together, because this was my final night of work ever. And here's someone, you know, there's a number of people whose paths I crossed and maybe lives I touched. And who would have expected this? A guy who lives in Boston, but for some reason he's at all these Mets games, spots me on the Jumbotron and actually comes out there to say hi.
Well, that's like your story with Greenberg and Robinson, right?
Alva Greenberg was involved with the Jewish community in New London for a while. She was living, by the way, she held at her home in Old Lyme. She invited the board of the Federation to come for some sort of reception. And I remember when I was there, she had a room that was devoted to Hank Greenberg. She had it was like a mini Cooperstown. She had a jersey, a bat, a glove, and things like that.
All right. Pictures. So let's summarize. Give me one sentence answers to all this. Jews love baseball because. One sentence.
Jews are as American as apple pie, if not more so, someone once said. The song Take Me Out to the Ball Game, the music was written by Albert von Tinsdale, whose real last name was Gombowski. His parents were immigrants. If you go to a Red Sox game, they're singing Sweet Caroline during the seventh inning.
Neil Diamond, right.
So there is some connection. I can't explain.
All right. Well, that was more than one sentence. That was more than one sentence, but I allowed it. All right. Next question. The top tier, I imagine, would be Koufax and Greenberg, right? Number one.
For sure.
All right. Give us the second tier under that. Just a couple of names.
I would say Al Rosen, even though he only played the 6 years, or I think it was, he was sensational. And by the way, I have to sort of draw the line between those that are practicing Jews and fully identified and those that were marginal, but we claim them because one of their relatives might have been Jewish. I'd have to say Ken Holtzman. He was the 2 no-hitters that he pitched, and he's still, my brother ran into him at a sports bar a couple times in Chicago, and they kibitz and talk about the good old days. So I'd say, players like that.
Okay, so Rosen and Holtzman. Got it. That's the second tier. Most memorable time you ever had in a ballpark, separate from the one at Citi Field. I assume that was
the most memorable. I'll have to say is the 2 games that I went to, where my granddaughters, Aaliyah and Hazel Rosenberg, sang the national anthem on the field. They were part of the choir at Temple Israel, the junior choir, and the junior choir of Temple Israel, combined with a couple of other junior choirs of other synagogues in New York City, at the Mets game once a year, sang the national anthem. And to see them on the field singing it, that was a real highlight.
All right. And what's the most?
Doesn't get any better than that.
Yeah. What's the most fantastic play you ever saw when you were actually at a ball game? Not on TV, not listening. The most exciting play you ever saw on the field.
Well, I don't have one. I mean, I in the last 40 years, I haven't been to that many games. By the way, I did get the free pass that they used to have at Fenway Park. For about 20 years, I would get it. It was a clergy pass. And if you, January 1st, if you sent in something on a letterhead and you were a clergy person, they would send you a free pass for you and a guest. And I did go to one game a year at that time there. But I'm going to share something that I did see on TV because in Chicago, as I said, we used to end school at 3 o'clock. We'd run home and catch the last inning or two of a Cubs game. And in 1953 or 4, I think it is, Sad Sam Jones was pitching for the Cubs, and he had a no-hitter going into the 9th inning. They were leading 1-0. He walked the first 3 players.
Oh.
And every Chicago
He
kid
needed 3 strikeouts. He needed 3 strikeouts.
He struck out the next 3 players. It doesn't.
Wow. That's a great one. All right. That's a good. It wasn't. It was on TV that you saw it. That was terrific.
Yeah.
All right. And so, final question. You're watching the series now. Give us you have a prediction? Who do you think is going to win the series?
Well, I don't have a horse in the race. That is to say, I'm not a major fan of Atlanta or Houston, although I used to live 60 miles. When I lived in Chicago, I was in the northern suburbs when we moved out of the inner city. And we were only 60 miles from Milwaukee. And we did go to at the old, what did they call it? County something stadium. We used to go to a number of Braves games and the days, when Hank Aaron was on the team. And so I think I would probably favor the Braves over the Astros. So if they won, and by the way, the Braves haven't been in a World Series, I think, since 1998. The Astros have been in 3. This is the 3rd time in 5 years.
Of course, the Braves stem from the original Boston Braves.
They were Boston Braves. That's true. That's true.
So, all right. So we got it. You're going to kind of, and I'm rooting for the Braves too, because my grandchildren in Boston are Braves fans because of that connection to the Boston Braves many years ago. All right, Aaron, this is terrific. Jews in baseball, one of the things that are interested to you and interesting to all of us. Watch this World Series. Enjoy baseball, and we'll see you all next time on Talkback. Bye. Bye, Aaron.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.